Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Rüstem Ertuğ Altınay. I'm a visiting scholar in the Faculty of Communications at KHAS University and the principal investigator of the project, Staging National Abjection, Theatre and Politics in Turkey and its Diasporas. The Performance and Politics webinar series and our broader project is funded by a European Research Council starting grant. And we are grateful to the European Commission and our host institution, KHAS University, for their generous support. Tonight, we are very happy and excited to host a very dear friend and much respected colleague, Bess Rowen. Our moderator will be İlhan Çamiçi. İlhan is a student in the PhD program in Communication Studies at KHAS University. His primary area of research is Jewish performance and theater in Turkey and its connected geographies. İlhan, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. So welcome to the 5th week of our KHAS ERC Performance and Politics webinar series. I want to remind you all that this meeting is being recorded and you will be able to watch it on our YouTube channel. My name is İlhan Çamiçi and I'm a PhD student and a graduate researcher here at ERC-funded project, Staging National Abjection, Theatre and Politics in Turkey and its Diasporas. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this week's book talk and introduce our speaker, Bess Rowen. Here at Staging National Abjection, we are grateful to our kind host, KHAS University, and European Commission for their generous support. First, Dr. Rowen will present her book, The Lines Between the Lines, How Stage Directions Affect Embodiment. And then we will open the webinar for questions from the audience. Before we start, I would like to remind you all that if you would like to be notified further of our future events, you can follow Staging National Abjection on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube through the handles you see on the screen, or you can leave your email address in the chat box so that we can collect it for our future announcements. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Bess Rowen. Bess Rowen is a theater theorist, historian, and practitioner. Her work focuses on what she terms affective stage directions, which are stage directions written in ways that engage the physical and emotional responses of future theater makers. Her first book, The Lines Between the Lines, How Stage Directions Affect Embodiment, was published by the University of Michigan Press in October 2021. Her next project stems from her work with the Transfeminism Working Group at the American Society for Theater Research, where she and her collaborators take up important issues of trans and non-binary representation in theater and performance. While pursuing her doctorate at CUNY, she was the recipient of the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship in Public Humanities, as well as a Graduate Center Dissertation Fellowship. She is an equity membership candidate and has studied acting at Michael Howard Studios, the Berkshire Theatre Festival, and the Gaiety School of Acting in Ireland. She has directed, stage managed, and even done a little playwriting. Bess also serves as the performance review editor of the Eugene O'Neill Review and the conference planner for the American Theatre and Drama Society. Recent articles can be found in Modern Drama, Theatre Topics, the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, and Theatre Journal, among others. Her avid interests include stage directions, gender and sexuality theory, female playwrights, Irish theatre, and theatrical rights. Dr. Rowen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ilhan. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. Here we go. All right. Can I just get a thumbs up from someone that we can see that? Fabulous. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with me here today for me. I'm going to be sharing a few parts of my book, The Lines Between the Lines, How Stage Directions Affect Embodiment, which, as Ilhan said, was just published by the University of Michigan Press. The first part I'm going to share with you is a section of my introduction, which both sets up the project and honors its roots in thinking that began in my time when I was actually with your wonderful professor, Altınay, here back at NYU. And then I'll move through a couple of the main sections of my argument. For a moment, Lane and Virginia experience a primal moment during which they are 7 and 9 years old inside the mind, respectively. They are mad. Then they return quite naturally to language, as adults do. When I read these lines from Sarah Ruhl's The Clean House, I am simultaneously a child watching my friend and her sister argue over a toy, and an adult seeing my mom and my aunts show flashes of their childhood dynamics. These lines move me by catalyzing an embodied understanding of this nonverbal communication. Lane and Virginia make sense to me through experiences that are specific to me and yet fit into a greater continuum of primal moments that each person brings to these words. Ruhl's lines for Lane and Virginia's primal moment are what launched me into this journey through the world of stage directions. I distinctly recall the moment I came upon these lines in the script because they stopped me dead in my tracks. They were different from other stage directions that I had encountered, but they were also intuitively logical to me. I realized that any actor playing Virginia or Lane would have to think of these stage directions as part of their character's lines. But how many variations of this primal moment could there be? I read these words first from an actor's perspective, but then became the stage manager for an undergraduate production, where I watched other actors interpret them night after night, relishing the opportunity to watch the minute variations to their performances that still followed these words. My curiosity led to my collecting unusual stage directions as I read through scripts and watched live performances for signs of these lines between the lines. I came to these stage directions from the practical realm as an actor, director, and theater technician before I began to think through what it meant that certain playwrights imparted information in this particular manner. The same year I read Ruhl's play for the first time, I also took my first class focused on literary theory. I became particularly fascinated by the ways that words, bodily postures, and gestures come to have meaning. And I kept returning to the particular example of language that must transition from the page of a play script to the stage of a theater, real or imagined. The final piece of the puzzle came from my twin interests in psychology and sociology, where I began to think through the ways our minds impact our bodies and the ways our bodies produce meaning in culture. This trajectory is still present in the current form of this project, where I come to these texts as practitioner, scholar, and someone deeply interested in human behavior. What could stage directions such as these mean for people trying to produce a play? How might they fit into the overall meaning of the play's logic and world? And what does their nonverbal approach tell us about how we communicate as corporeal people? Returning to Virginia and Lane for a primal moment, a number of questions and conclusions jump out at me upon my first reading. For example, the characters are transported to their respective childhood ages before returning to language, underlining that this moment is nonverbal and psychologically informative. They do not speak angry words to each other, but rather defer to a silent standoff that seemingly has a history in their relationship. The characters are sisters, and their dialogue further reveals a complicated relationship that contextualizes these stage directions. Also, what kind of 7 and 9-year-olds were Lane and Virginia? Is this ghosting of their prior relationship a continuation of the power dynamics of the dialogue spoken in the moments before, or does it mark a distinct shift? Regardless of the answers directors and actors come to, tackling these lines is part of the journey Ruhl has written into Lane and Virginia's roles. As the last line reveals, this piece of text is meant to be translated to two bodies so fully that the words themselves do not need to be spoken before the two return to language. These liminal words bridge the imagined space between written language and embodied performance. These stage directions both contain and create a mood that sets the tone of this silent moment for the reader, actor, and/or director. Yet Ruhl's words provide room for a variety of performative possibilities. This project begins with a simple premise, that the lines of text comprising stage directions are lines for readers and production teams to consider and interpret. And yet the actor does not and cannot interact with these words as they would their lines of dialogue. If actors spoke these stage directions, then the English-speaking audience member would have a clearer understanding of the nuances of the situation rule describes. But in their silent form, the range of performances and possible interpretations of this primal moment multiplies. Although language itself can be interpreted in a variety of different ways, through shifts in inflection and bodily comportment, for example, the reading of silent bodies is further complicated by individual modes of expression, cultural norms and gestures, and the differences between bodies and bodily experiences. Stage directions are lines of a play written for a possible theatrical performance alongside the lines of dialogue, but they do not behave in the same way and are not treated as equally important. Therefore, this project argues that stage directions matter a great deal to the overall meaning of a play, but how the stage direction is written is an equally important factor when considering how they act on those who read and perform them. Because stage directions are the site of an encounter between the written language and the nonverbal embodied aspects of performance, they provide one of the most expansive ways for an individual's specific cultural experiences to become a part of the play. This potential is particularly present in stage directions describing the feel of a scene, aspects of experience that are even more subjective than specific emotional states and visual descriptions of actions and scenarios. Not all stage directions are written in this manner, but those that are create environments in which a fuller diversity of human embodied experience can be represented and accessed, challenging our assumptions and stereotypes of theatrical bodies. This collaboration enables each production of a given play to perform portions of the text in ways that are both faithful to the playwright's words and unique to the cultural and temporal specificities of that particular moment. Ignoring these more abstract pieces of play texts in performance or in scholarship misses the opportunity to interrogate our embodied assumptions and what identities and experiences we fail to represent in the process of imagining and creating theater. The bodies we readers, theater makers, and scholars imagine as we read impacts the kind of performers we cast in productions, meaning that part of the problem of diverse representation begins at a level of reading. The United States is currently experiencing a cultural reckoning about the paucity of BIPOC representation on our stages. Although reading stage directions differently cannot solve this problem, affective stage directions in American plays contain more possibilities for embodied representation than we currently recognize. This is not solely an American problem, but this project is situated within the confines of English language plays from the United States because my knowledge of American culture on and off stage is part of my methodological grounding. This project must begin in my cultural home, but it should not end here. Affective stage directions exist across languages and cultures, but I do keep my focus in this project to the United States to show how these lines between the lines can be a means of interrogating our cultural theatrical processes. Shifting our thinking about stage directions by focusing on the performative and affective forces within them enables us to unlock new potential in what stories plays can tell, while also holding space for the cluster of potential performances that surround these lines. I call the written lines between the lines that engage our bodily imaginations affective stage directions, a term I first introduced in my 2018 Theater Journal article, Undigested Reading, Rethinking Stage Directions Through Affect. This project continues the work of proving that certain stage directions are written in ways that are performative and affective, transmitting nonverbal information via embodied words in ways that merge the cultural embodiments of the playwright with those who will come to read and perform their plays. But stage directions are not all the same, and treating them that way has inhibited our appreciation of them up until now. stage directions such as rules, primal moment, are the result of a synthesis of several specific forces, namely the separation of the roles of playwright, director, and actor, the rise of printed play texts, and the proliferation of theatrical genres that required tonal information to be added to dialogue for a printed script to be legible to lay readers. The history of writing stage directions is entwined with the histories of print culture and performance practices. Thus, the contemporary proliferation of stage directions is a result of some very specific shifts in form and style. William B. Worthen writes in The Print and Poetics of Modern Drama that George, quote, Bernard Shaw's idiosyncratic notions about, well, about everything, but particularly about how his plays should be done into print, mark a decisive moment in the booking of modern drama, the effort to render the book a distinct platform for the play's realization, end quote. Marvin Carlson and Martin Puchner also point to Shaw as the first playwright writing in English to change stage directions from something recorded by a stage manager in a prompt book to often fanciful and rich descriptions of the set, characters, and subtext included by playwrights. This confluence of changing form and content is not accidental. Historically, the role and function of stage directions has transformed as playwriting and play printing practices have changed. As is well documented in historical and acting texts, the technical specifications for props and movement were often embedded in the spoken text from Greek and Roman times through Shakespeare's work. Exit Pursued by a Bear from The Winter's Tale is perhaps the most famous historical stage direction in English, but the exact authorship of this and other stage directions in Shakespeare's works is hard to prove. My first chapter takes up issues of authorship in more detail, but for now, it is important to note that prompt books and early stage managers controlled the domain of stage directions for much of history. But toward the end of the 19th century, this practice shifted considerably. During the second half of the 19th century, Shaw and others began to experiment with form in terms of both dialogue and stage directions. Around this same time, the year 1868 saw the famous lawsuit in which Augustin Daly claimed artistic ownership over the staging of the railroad scene in his play Under the Gaslight. That's the image in the center of my slide, arguing that it could be plagiarized. By winning his case, Daly played a part in copyright protections expanding to nonverbal portions of scripts. Several years later, in 1874, the decision in the case of Toole versus Young ruled that adapting novels into plays by turning some lines into stage directions was a form of distinct creation, implying that the written words of the book and the silent words behind the performances of a play function in different ways. As these cases illustrate, the roles of theater makers were being newly delineated as directors struggled to protect their unique visions of plays. But the fact that the legal decisions referred to these creative contributions as stage directions, which is indeed how they're referred to, leads to questions of authorship and authority. Some theater makers cite the dubious authorship of certain stage directions as one justification for resisting these italicized lines. Directors and actors alike have often considered printed stage directions to be an archival record of another actor's performance choices. Combined with the idea that detailed stage directions present the novelistic musings of playwrights like Shaw, Eugene O'Neill, and Tennessee Williams, has led to a frequent complaint that lengthy stage directions are the signs of a playwright who is trying to control the actor's body and craft. Actor and teacher Uta Hagen famously advised actors to, quote, cross out these descriptions and let your own sense of the character guide you. An experienced actor learns to read the play for the human intentions without the descriptions, end quote. Théâtre Libre's founder and director André Antoine reportedly closely adhered to dialogue, but crossed out most stage directions in favor of his own. The concept of directors having their own stage directions is another complexity that litters the history of dramatic copyright law through the current moment. Meanwhile, the worlds of theater and theatrical publishing were already changing and continued to do so with the dawn of the 20th century. New forms of writing were particularly encouraged by the rise of the genres of realism and naturalism, where the description of setting, costumes, props, physical and psychological aspects of the characters themselves all became more important to the play. In this vein, playwrights such as Henrik Ibsen, Anton Chekhov, and O'Neill began to write stage directions that seemed to reach out from the page with the desire to do something more than simply dictate movements, instead providing information about inner thoughts and feelings, as well as notes about the overall tone and mood for various characters and scenes. The shift in various styles of writing affective stage directions is part of how the nonverbal information comes across. Affect, at its most basic, is a term that describes our human embodied capacity to affect others and be affected by others. Have you ever felt the mood in the room? Then you've experienced affect. Unusual stage directions inherently create room for interpretation, since they are not easily pinned down in terms of meaning. Contrary to the assertions that lengthy stage directions aim for control, I argue that the concept of affective stage directions reveals how playwrights can embrace the nuances of different bodies performing at various locations and historical moments. Again, not all stage directions are written in this manner, but when affective information is included, production teams should engage with that challenging aspect of the text. The words in affective stage directions connect the bodies of character and actor over and through a play text, rekindling the shared feelings that connect humans across time and space, while also acknowledging that no one has precisely the same experience. Affective stage directions, I argue, are a means of explaining the relationship between an actor's body in terms of the internal relationship between actor and character, as well as the external relationships between actor/character and other characters and audience members. In other words, these kinds of stage directions provide an opportunity for readers, theater makers, and scholars to discuss how an actor is affected by the character enough to step into that character's skin, but also how an actor can affect other characters and audience members once in the body of that character. As Teresa Brennan writes, a key component of understanding how bodies experience affect come from the ability of a body to, quote, shift its affections, its being affected, into action, or its capacity to affect, end quote. Though this ability need not mean that the actor feels every specific emotion the character feels, these stage directions do require the actors to understand the character's affect in some embodied fashion, at least enough to avoid contradicting it. By analyzing how individual actors and directors collaborate with affective stage directions, especially in ways that speak to an embodied cultural moment, I am suggesting that theater makers can include a greater range of interpretations and representations of both bodies and ideas in plays. This method of thinking through text also allows for theater makers to use the space provided by the writing styles of certain contemporary playwrights to make theater that is more directly relevant to a particular community's concerns. From their earliest iterations, affective stage directions have served as playful challenges to the form of traditional play texts. And in their most cutting, they subvert theatrical norms and stereotypes. Our theatrical assumption about which/whose bodies are called for in performance is not simply a theoretical concern, but one that has serious repercussions in the real world. Contemporary audiences think nothing of seeing women play female roles that were written for male actors in Shakespeare's plays, and yet there are still instances of resistance to people of color playing roles initially written for white actors. Take, for example, the controversy surrounding a production of Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in Portland, Oregon in 2017, after they attempted to cast an African-American actor in the role of Nick and were denied the rights by Edward Albee's estate because of Albee's character description of Nick as blonde and the references to his blonde hair and blue eyes in the script. The assumption expressed by the estate here is that people of color cannot have blonde hair or blue eyes. And yet I doubt that the casting of a naturally redheaded and brown-eyed actor would have caused offense. Although the words cited here were not technically stage directions, the italicized silent words describing a character's appearance often are. Albee's estate was not truly defending the text, in case that much was not obvious, but the fact that the text was cited as a source for the decision is at the core of why we need to interrogate our assumptions when we begin inserting live actors into written play scripts. Affective stage directions include the aspects of performance the playwright deems important for embodiment, and focusing on what is and what is not present in these words highlights a great deal of assumption when it comes to staging plays. Representation matters, and therefore the words that script bodily representation matter as well. In order to show you what this can look like, I'm going to give you some excerpts from the actual chapters of my book. But I must start with a definition that I've had up on this slide. Affective stage directions are stage directions written in a manner that aims to engage the actor affectively in the thoughts, feelings, and/or mood of a given moment, character, scene, or overall play. Affective stage directions are about why, and more abstractly, how certain events happen, as opposed to what happens. This stands in contrast to stage directions which simply describe the actions a character takes or what physically occurs on stage, such as mechanically repeatable stage directions. He sits down, she moves the cup, and so on. Whereas many stage directions are interested in what a character is doing, or a straightforward description of what a particular action looks like, affective stage directions are more concerned with internal mechanisms of why and how over their external expressions. In historical plays, affective stage directions offer avenues for exploring how our concepts of embodied representation have shifted by enabling the performance of an analogous version of the affective information contained in the stage directions that is better suited to a contemporary moment. Let us take, for example, the stage directions African-American playwright Eulalie Spence used to introduce a character in her 1927 play, The Starter. She writes, "T.J. Kelly's face is the most important thing that ever happened to him. For the rest, T.J. is tall, dapper, and in love." This is both incredibly specific and completely abstract in terms of what performance is meant to express these words. Is TJ aware that his face is the most important thing ever to happen to him? Or is this a value judgment placed on him by those around him? The former makes TJ a handsome but arrogant man who knows that he does not have to try very hard, while the latter might render him as someone who tries to achieve something in life only for others to take pity on him for being attractive but little else. Which TJ came to mind? Or did a third version of TJ enter the stage in your mind? Is this the same sensory impression you would have of TJ if Spence had written, "TJ Kelly has a handsome face," or "TJ Kelly isn't too bright, but he is handsome"? Spence's crisp sarcasm is part of the affective information provided within these stage directions, and it affects those who read it along with the content of its lines. Or what about Jen Silverman's play, Collective Rage, a play in 5 Bettys, in essence, a queer and occasionally hazardous exploration? Do you remember when you were in middle school and you read about Shackleton and how he explored the Antarctic? Imagine the Antarctic as a pussy, and it's sort of like that. That is the entire title of that play, in which one character is described as Latina, high femme, super queer. Although Latina is currently a somewhat stable identifier, the description becomes increasingly subjective as the short phrase continues. High femme has shifted in meaning as styles of dress and makeup have changed, as the feminine norms referenced by this kind of queer female representation continue to evolve. Super queer is, of course, completely subjective and wholly dependent on a particular production's cultural specificity. Silverman also sometimes notes the response to her characters instead of how they present, using the second person pronouns within the stage directions. Silverman introduces Betty 5 by noting that, quote, "She is equally butch and has even more awesome tattoos." Betty 5 is wildly charismatic, and if you were a lady, even a straight lady, you'd get fluttery, end quote. Again, these affective stage directions orient production teams and readers to the particular queerness of these characters performing on the reader. What does a butch woman who would make a straight woman fluttery look like to you? Or what stands out about this imagined Betty? Does she have a particular style of clothing? Or is it an expression, a look, or maybe even an overall vibe that is conjured by these lines? If the director and actor handle this moment felicitously, meaning that they simply allow the stage directions to perform on them, it is very likely that the audience will be affected in some way like this, or at least understand that this is the desired effect. Some scenes rely so heavily on affective stage directions that crucial pieces of information are revealed through their nonverbal communication. In the midst of Annie Baker's ultra-realistic Pulitzer Prize-winning drama, The Flick, movie theater projectionist Rose tries to flirt with new hire and movie buff Avery. After attempting some stilted conversation and ignoring Avery's complete lack of interest, Avery is later revealed to be gay, Rose switches tactics to a more direct means of getting his attention. The scene reads as follows. Avery glances up at the projection booth. Rose is moving around doing something. She sees him and pumps her fist in the air in a "we're gonna party" gesture. Avery tries to smile. He moves to the other side of the theater and starts cleaning. Rose knocks on the window and holds up a CD, wiggling her eyebrows. Avery shrugs and shakes his head like, "What are you saying?" Inside the projection booth, we probably can't see this, Rose inserts the CD into the sound system. An extremely danceable hip-hop classic from the past decade comes blasting into the theater. Maybe Jay-Z's "I Just Want to Love You." Avery is startled. He tries to keep sweeping. He's not sure what is happening. Rose leaves the projection booth and 10 seconds later kicks through the door, grooving to the music. "Dance party?" Avery laughs anxiously. Rose grooves down the aisle. Avery bobs his head up and down, trying to look supportive. "Come on." Avery shakes his head no, still bobbing supportively. Rose rolls her eyes, disappointed, but then proceeds to do a totally awesome improvised dance in the aisle and maybe even in some of the rows. She's really wild and weird and uninhibited. It's pretty cathartic. It should be different every night. Maybe she incorporates a couple of moves from Bhangra and/or hip hop and/or West African dance classes from her past. This lasts about 2 minutes. Avery stands in his row, bobbing his head the whole time. Finally, Rose tuckers herself out. The song is still blasting. These stage directions are not stylistically anomalous in this play, or indeed in Baker's other plays. Baker frequently uses affective stage directions in her work, which is part of how her plays communicate such strong moods within their famous silences and pauses. The fact that these stage directions communicate the mood of the scene is not what makes them stand out, but the frenetic action of this moment is startling, not only to Avery, but to the audience. The movement vocabulary up until this point has been slow and methodical, as it is generally comprised of slow sweeping gestures in the theater space and long periods of silence between the two male employees. Not only is the blaring music a stark contrast to the realistic, prolonged silences that characterize the rest of the play, but Rose's really wild and weird and uninhibited dance break is a visceral as well as visual shift in the play's tone and mood. These stage directions extend into the scene's dialogue that follows, highlighting the disparity between Rose, who has physically exerted herself and is out of breath, and Avery, who has quietly nodded along to the music. I think it would be hard to argue that these stage directions don't tell us crucial information about how Avery and Rose relate to each other. She tries desperately to get his attention, and he is polite but never meets that enthusiasm. There is a great deal communicated here, but the dance should never look the same, even within the same production. Affective stage directions can also apply to embodying the entire mood and tone of a setting, such as in Brandon Jacobs Jenkins's initial stage directions for his play Appropriate. Jacobs Jenkins writes, "Light abandons us and a darkness replaces it. Instantly, a billion cicadas begin trilling in the dense, velvety void, loudly, insistently, without pause, before hopefully at some point becoming the void. The insect song fills and sweeps the theater in pulsing, pitch black waves over and beyond the stage, washing itself over the walls and the floors, baptizing the aisles and the seats, forcing itself into every inch of space, every nook, every pocket, hiding place, and pore, until this incessant chatter is touching you. It is touching you. This goes on and on and on and on and on until the thought occurs in every head. Is this it? Is this the whole show? These stage directions must not only affect the actors, but also the designers, who must be moved to create a sound design that can properly impart and transmit this affective information. There are many ways of performing these stage directions in production. No two will look or sound the same, but each one should feel similar to other iterations. Each of my chapters goes through myriad examples of how these stage directions serve as playgrounds for creative minds to shift how you think through the potential interactions between printed texts and embodied people. I want to be clear that going along with the affective information a playwright provides isn't the only option. In his play, This Is How It Goes, Neil Butte writes stage directions in a conversational tone, not often found in his work. The lightness of the delivery is belied by the fact that this play is about a white man, simply named Man, who returns to his hometown and sees his white high school friend, Woman, is now married to a black man named Cody, who LaBute describes as unnerving. In the hands of another playwright, I might be less concerned about where this play was headed. Perhaps I would prepare myself for a play designed to confront the man's clear racism. Yet when LaBute writes, quote, "The woman laughs at this, an easy laugh. She's loosening up a bit. That's nice," end quote, I instead sense a tone of condescension. Side note, I'm not putting these on a slide because I don't want to give them any more power, but I'm more than happy to talk about that choice at the end if you have a question about it. LaBute's attitude toward both the woman and Cody seems dismissive, as shown by the stage directions describing a fictional story narrated by the man in which Cody physically assaults the woman on stage. In this imagined encounter, Cody stalks the woman around the room when, quote, Cody continues to move toward her as she backs away. Finally, she comes up against a love seat and is trapped. She looks at him, shit scared. I mean, come on, wouldn't you be? LaBute's casual tone exacerbates his explicit calling in of the particularly gendered and racialized stereotypes of a white woman being threatened by a black man. The implication of his question, wouldn't you be, is that any rational person would be on the woman's side here. And yet the fact that this scene is a fabrication, a fantasy of the white male protagonist is not acknowledged in these affective stage directions at all. On the contrary, LaBute's affective stage directions perform a distinct lack of surprise at yet another image of a violent black man out to get a white woman because, I mean, come on, as the title says, this is how it goes. I go into further detail about what to do with explicitly toxic affective stage directions at the end of my book's second chapter. But for now, this negative example shows how playwrights deal with thematic issues in their affective stage directions gives a reader and production team a great deal of information about the aspects of a playwright's ideology that might be more nuanced in spoken dialogue. In these cases, the affect transmitted can encourage a response instead of a replication. It is possible to transmit misogyny, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other toxic ideologies to performers who must perform those attitudes repeatedly without many explicit opportunities to challenge those harmful assumptions. And yet there is currently no terminology that production teams or scholars can use to analyze the impact of the tone and the content, both separately and together. Affective stage directions highlight this duality without a value judgment. Categorizing a stage direction as affective still requires an interpretation of the quality of that affective information as the individuals reading or performing it think through the style of this line and how it performs on their minds and bodies. This also means that the same words can have radically different meanings in the work of different playwrights. For example, I might read the stage directions above as a vicious critique of racism and misogyny from a playwright like Young Jean Lee, but someone with a different impression of Labute might be able to give him the benefit of the doubt that I cannot. Some affective stage directions are providing avenues by which to resist historical misrepresentations of gender and sexuality. Others are presenting opportunities to insert more expansive understandings of these concepts than were available at the time of the play's writing, while still others are scripting explicit subversions of cultural norms. This not only applies to the themes of gender and sexuality in theater, but also in discussions of race, another topic that American theater has actively avoided discussing for the majority of our history. How have playwrights changed representations of racialized bodies through affective stage directions? And how can production teams use affective stage directions and color conscious casting to create new resonances for plays not written to deal critically with race? The answer to both of these questions stems from a fundamental rethinking of the bodily representations of race and racialized stereotypes in the American theater. Michael Zakharoff believes that, quote, cases of liberated didascalia, which is just a fancy word for stage directions, are of course unusual, end quote. Noting that the stage directions we deem worthy of comment are unusual examples of, quote, stage directions crying out for release from their normally subservient status, end quote. I disagree. Quite to the contrary, I think that liberated stage directions are everywhere if you choose to look for them. In this way, my book can be thought of as a set of stage directions for future readers. Will these silent, generally unspoken, words change your approach to future play scripts? Have I affected your process? It is up to you to approach affective stage directions as you see fit. But if you feel moved by a given stage direction, or you pause to wonder at the specific resonance its words conjure in you, then this work is happening. As I have said, the examples in these pages are purposefully limited to my primary cultural lens, but it is my hope that some of you might take up this work and lend your own cultural expertise to playwrights writing in other languages and cultural contexts to reveal new dimensions to the concept of affective stage directions. These words do not represent the final moments of this project. Instead, they should mark a new beginning for how we engage with the lines between the lines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rowen, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I would like to open the floor for questions from our audience. You can raise your virtual hands to ask questions, or you can also ask your questions from the chat box so that we can read it. Okay, first question comes from Berkham.
Dr. Rowen, thank you so much for this inspirational and awesome talk. It affected the way that I actually am currently approaching to play text, and I guess it will forever be like part of my decision making in interpreting, engaging with that material, I guess. And especially like since you clearly stated this. How can I say this? Two criticisms as approaching stage directions, both as a foregrounding experience that frames stage directions as, I don't know, a space between text and a meta text that can be experienced only, that is a unique experience only for the actors or the directors. No one ever thinks about the potential that it promises about things that it does not say most of the time, and like also the implications that this kind of approach has on our general interpretation of the material. And this makes me actually more curious about your future work. I mean, what and how do you think this step will take you to another space and another step, especially thinking and knowing that you are pretty much interested in gender and queer theory? I'm very much actually curious, how will it transform into a next level, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. Thank you for, first of all, thank you for your very kind words and that very interesting question, multifaceted question. I will say that first of all, my fourth chapter I talk about something called multivalent stage directions, which are stage directions that say you can do this or you can do this. And my thing is always, that implies that you can also do something totally different that's in the same realm as those things, but is your cultural and like specific moments translation of whatever that is. And I like that a lot. I think that's really, really interesting. And playwrights who write like that are often really open to that, which I think is important too. In terms of next steps for this project, the next immediate thing I want to do is I think that stage directions are not just things in theater. I think that this relationship applies to tons of unspoken words that we follow as rules, but don't interrogate. So anything from cooking instructions to laws to honestly, my Artu will remember this, my NYU thesis was about how sorority handbooks script the embodiment of sorority women, which is absolutely stage directions. Like they're the same thing. So I think that there's a ton of affect that is kind of falls out in these moments where it's not normally we're reading these things out loud, but still we're translating them to our body. So we're pulling something out of them. And I don't think we often think about that process. So I'm excited to do that. I've been training as an intimacy choreographer. So I'm also thinking about how to actually stage those moments of not just, at this moment, it's not just about staging physical intimacy. It's also about staging cultural competency in the nonverbal moments. So practically, that's the boots on the ground part. And in terms of scholarship, I think that this concept expands outside of the theater. So that's the two places that this work is headed right now. I hope that answers your question.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Shayda.
Thank you, Dr. Rowen. This was like very amazing. I wish I had encountered your study before I wrote my undergraduate thesis. I also looked at stage directions, and I think what you might call it affective stage direction. One was from Simon Stephens's Pornography. It was only this line, images of hell, they are silent. And I have meticulously worked with that stage direction for months. And right now, I'm thinking about, after listening to you, so many thoughts I have. That's why this will be a kind of rambling.
I'm not concerned about that.
Your project. Last week, we also discussed with Jale Hoca about the Turkish terminology for stage directions. And then I thought that, okay, why stage directions? Do you think, why not stage instructions? Why descriptions, but why stage directions particularly? And we couldn't find a suitable Turkish translation for that. And we were discussing, okay, how can we engage with this concept in the case of your book, especially because the word directions also have connotations about the lines.
Yes.
Line a point to. So that's why I was thinking about this kind of connotations of this word choice, the general terminology of stage directions,
yes.
and your ideas about how the lines between the lines operates in theater and in everyday life. So can you elaborate on this idea?
Sure, I totally can. So something that's been foundational in my understanding and kind of resistance to, yes, the sense of direction as in like being direct, right? It implies a straight line. And I think that what my initial, this work comes out of my dissertation work. And my initial work on this topic was really, I was struck by a paragraph from Sarah Ahmed, who's a queer theorist out of Britain. And she talks about, in this book, Queer Phenomenology, she talks about how being queer, we experience the world in a different way. So our sense of orientation is literally like, the idea of having an orientation is also a directional metaphor. And so in my sense, I'm like, I have a queer approach to stage directions in the sense that I don't think they're a straight line. I come to them kind of sideways. And so she says that the word direct, again, comes from direction, relates to this idea of direct, which means getting straight to the point. But we know that directions aren't often getting straight to the point. So a queer direction for her is something that goes at something slantwise. So again, borrowing that metaphor, instead of a straight line, it's a slanted line. And I think that's interesting since stage directions are normally italicized. They're literally slanted lines, right? They're slanted lines in between lines that are written straight. And often they're not even structured on the page, just going across like this. Sometimes they're structured interestingly on the page. So for me, what I love about the stage directions I'm interested to is that they never get straight to the point. They are always throwing you some instructions that can kind of get you there, but you're all going to end up at different places that are still kind of in the same town or in the same genre of things, right? And I think that the language here gets particularly abstract because it isn't saying, okay, the character gets up, he walks to the side, he puts the cup down, like these very specific directional blocking lines. But the funny thing is that for me, it's the difference between giving someone turn by turn instructions and saying something like, when you get to the old building that used to be an ice cream factory, then you're going to know that you're close by. Like, it's the difference between someone describing how something feels instead of what it actually is. And someone saying, okay, right, so you're going to go 75 feet and then you're going to make a left. And that's how we go. They both get you to the same place vaguely, right? But the process is very different. And the way that we respond to those kinds of instructions is different. And I kind of like the idea of direction, even though I don't think it's a perfect term, right? Because even staging directions, like if a director is directing you, the director isn't supposed to say to you, I want you to do it exactly like this, right? The director is supposed to say to you, okay, what can I get out of you here? So it needs to be collaborative. And that's the part that I think people miss when they think about stage directions as direct, rules that you're supposed to follow instead of these moments of conversation. So that's kind of, I do think the directional metaphor is real, and it's something I think about a lot. And I mention it in my book, although I no longer found the book is no longer structured as being solely built upon queer theory. It is throughout, but the queer theory isn't kind of the primary source anymore. Because I realized that since no one else had talked about stage directions, I kind of had to do that part first before I got to what I thought was queer about them in a fun way. So that is an affectively rendered answer to your question that was not straight to the point, but hopefully that was some of your question. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Any further questions? Okay, maybe I can ask one. Oh, okay. Hocam, okay. You may. Okay. So I kind of understand that stage directions are sites of like conflicting authorities, and there are multiple conflicts between like playwright, actor, playwright, director, or text and performance.
Mm-hmm.
So like there are multiple ways of looking at it, and it seemed to me that like the dynamics in like published texts are kind of different. So these are, you kind of mentioned that a little as well,
Yes.
and like it's like they demand certain permanence, and they like claim as if they are the true form of staging that play. So my question would be like, do you think that effective stage directions should only be seen as suggestive, like as suggestions, or is there any situation that comes to your mind maybe when it may be actually wrong to play with the stage directions? Because like maybe an example of a reversed situation of what you mentioned of toxic affective stage directions. in which manipulating the stage direction has a toxic agenda, maybe, I don't know.
That's a really really good question. I think that again, I have a sort of duality to this answer, because I do not care about people replicating stage directions that really do sound like they're just a historical record of someone else's performance. And we have this exists in, Samuel French acting editions of things. It's like blocking there that you can tell a playwright didn't write. But my argument has always been that if a playwright has written it down, you have to at least consider it. You have to. And considering it doesn't always mean that you're trying to work against it. But if, you might fail. You might fail at doing the stage directions in a way that moves people. But if you've considered them and the performance conditions are right, this is where performativity comes into play, right? Like, if the stage directions act on you and the circumstances are correct and you're performing those things as that character in the play, it could still fail. Like, it could still not work for folks, but you haven't failed if you've taken them seriously and tried to go on that journey. So I do think there are moments where, there are fundamental parts of plays that require the moments of nonverbal communication to be real. Again, I mean, the Annie Baker example I have, if you cut those stage directions or you manipulate those stage directions, you get a totally different scene because there's no dialogue for most of that scene. So, I think it is important that you try to manage to impart those feelings that Rose has and Avery has in that moment. And we could misinterpret that as an audience and think they're doing it wrong. But I do think that at the moment, I'm more concerned about there are two moments of response to affective stage directions, right? There's the moment between reading it on the page and performing it, and the moment between performing it and watching it being performed and trying to think back, okay, why is this in the play? Like, is this part of the play or did the actor create this, right? I have admittedly spent a lot more time on the first part of that relationship. And I think that actually your question is really smart, because I think that the reception aspect of this is where we get into questions of like, when is it ethical and when is it not ethical to try to push something beyond the boundaries of what an audience might get. And that's a really important question, and one that I did not have time to take up here, but I have spent time thinking about. So in short, I think that you always have to consider, if you have a licensing agreement and you're doing the play, you're promising to do all of the play, and thinking about the stage directions is part of the play. And if you remove some of the stage directions for whatever reason, that's a different play. That's often a different play. And again, in the Neil LaBute example, I would agree with why you'd want to remove those stage directions, but I also think you can't. Like, I think you have to figure out another approach to them to make them okay to impart to an audience. So I do think there are scenarios where messing with the stage directions would be very bad. But I also think that interpreting them is never bad, even if we don't like what the interpretation is. I think that they're written in a way to be interpreted, and we can disagree, but if someone has actually thought about them, then that's their interpretation and they're doing those stage directions.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
So, Jal Hocam, may I ask a question? You are muted right now.
There you go.
Yes, I try to add myself to spotlight. It was a great and inspiring talk. Thank you a lot, really. Just before the talk, I have hundreds of questions to ask. Now I have thousands of questions in my mind. I will not ask you all of them, but it's so inspiring, and my mind is working very fast right now, because as a theater practitioner, I have problems with stage direction. I have also, as Şeyda said before, we have problems with the word itself. Also, I am thinking about what does that mean in Turkish theater. So there are thousands of questions in my mind, actually. But I don't. But for instance, I can say that, I mean, in Turkish, we, in theory, we are calling stage directions didaskalia. In practice, we call it in practice, when we are in the rehearsal, for example, we said the things written in parentheses.
Yeah.
So it's right, it's easy to tell like that.
Sure.
But I am thinking about the new playwrights, I mean, new generation. I am one of them. We are not writing stage directions. So writing them or not writing them, and we are also criticized because of not writing stage directions. But most of the plays that we wrote are not printed. They are written in order to be staged. I mean, you finished the play, and next day you're in the rehearsal space in the studio, etc. So, but I am thinking about, as an playwright, the thing that I would like to say without the characters. So this is very interesting for me, because I am about to publish my my plays, and it's a big problem facing with those things. So it's very effective because it's a kind of a story. It's didaskalia becomes, as you tell, your work is telling me, am I right? I am not sure, but it's kind of the author's, the playwright's storyboard. Yeah. So it's very interesting to think those, I mean, but also the examples that you, or the cases that you work on are, I don't know the place, but I can understand that the author also continues to the flow of the literary flow.
Yes.
So when I'm thinking of the didaskalia I faced, they're always like really the directions, like he enters, blah, blah, blah, blah, those kind of things, you know, just this, like orders. Mm-hmm. So that in practice, we are always actors, and I'm not an actor, but I'm doing the directing things, etc. So we are always erasing
them out. Yeah, as you should. As you should. No one needs those.
But on the other hand, if you read once, you cannot get rid of it from your mind. This doesn't mean that you have to do it, but the author is there. So it's also effective. You don't have to do the same, the same direction. But it's very interesting, and just thinking about what has changed in Turkish theater literature, for instance, in didaskalia, as following your analysis or your work, your book. So it's very inspiring. It's not a question actually, but because I would like to share the things that maybe you would like to add something on these.
Yeah,
lots of things.
I love that. And I told you, I would love for you to email me all the rest of those questions. I would love to hear them. No, I think what I'm thinking of as you speak, first of all, my first chapter deals with plays that have spoken stage directions, which I think is a direction that I'm seeing a lot of, particularly African-American playwrights go with here. But I think they are another way of putting stage directions in the play, but they're different because the actors speak them out loud, and somehow that feels less like you're trying to make an actor do something. But I'm also thinking of this. I read once a book where a director was trying to direct Samuel Beckett, and I don't know how familiar you are with Samuel Beckett's work, but he is
stage direction. He is actually himself.
He's really into stage directions, and his estate will really sue you. Like, they're excited to sue you. So they're very angry. They're like the angriest estate ever. And this director was trying to do something with a play, and he said, you know what? I'm going to start by crossing out all the stage directions, and he did a production of Endgame. And at some moment in tech, he went back to look at the script and he was doing all the stage directions, but he had come to them by himself, but he was doing everything that had been written down. And he was like, that's very interesting because I thought I was doing something totally different. So again, I agree with you. I think they get in your head. But also I think, again, the more playful ones are reaching out to you and saying, listen, it's like, I feel like the playwright's pulling you aside and going, I don't know what you want to do here, but like, here's what's in my head. Whatever you feel like doing, go for it. And I think that people respond to that really well, because I feel like actors, honestly, I once met an actor who told me that she hated Sarah Rule, which is fine. I mean, I don't feel any strong protection of Sarah Rule, but I was curious about it because I'd never heard that before. And I asked her why. And she said, well, Sarah Rule, I hate her stage directions. And I said, really, why? And she said, well, they tell me what to do. And I said, that's fascinating because she also tells you what to say, but you're not concerned about that as an actor, are you? And like, it's funny to me because that distinction, right? Of like, oh no, she's jumping into my craft, which is not every single thing that I'm saying on stage, but it's only the stuff in between, was fascinating to me. So I think that divide is real, that like, we think, oh no, the moments in between are for the actors, and they are, but we can still give the actors things to play with, just the way no two actors say the line the same way. No two actors are going to act the stage directions the same way. So I think we need to stop thinking about it as us scripting exactly what they're doing, because it is a script. But as anyone who's seen the same play in different productions knows, it's never exactly the same, right? I think this is why we keep doing plays that we've seen before.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to say, add something that in the rehearsal space, you need something to activate your creativity and imagination. And also, if you would like to, reading those effective stage directions I'm talking about, not the ones that lead you to do something, force you, but it also, the examples, the cases that you show us also encourages me and to look at to the didascalia in that way, but also to create didascalia reading. So it's something really, the actor is the performers are very alone on the stage, and they need something. This doesn't mean that they need a real direction, but something to activate. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, I guess not.
I have a quick question.
So,
Bess, this was just amazing. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk. And I learned a lot, not only as a person who's trying to write about theater finally, but also who is writing plays and sometimes even writing stage directions. So my question is actually, is it possible to have stage directions that are not effective? And how should we evaluate them? Like, is there like a broad spectrum, if you like, of effective stage directions? Okay, how do we engage with that?
There totally is. And the way I set the book up is I actually think there is the openness for interpretation of the stage directions goes from like the very basic affective, the primal moment stage direction, for example, to what I call choreographic stage directions, which are again, like the Annie Baker one I gave you, a totally wild and weird and uninhibited dance. What does that look like? Like that's asking for a whole choreography that is not explained, that is supposed to be different every night. Then there's multivalent stage directions, which again say you can do it this way, or maybe you do it this way, which implies you also maybe do it another way that I didn't write down. And then the final one is impossible stage directions, which I don't believe exist, but there are stage directions that ask for things you couldn't actually do, which implies that in order to do them, you have to do something totally different that makes us feel like that. So those are the range of affective stage directions, but I really think any stage direction that you read that gives you pause and makes you wonder what it's saying is affective. And I describe it as, it's like, again, to use the affect as being like the mood in the room. It's like you're walking into the play and the stage directions are kind of telling you what the vibe is. And if you feel like they're trying to tell you something, then I would listen to that. And if you don't, because they're a literal visual description, that's usually, those are the ones that I think are not affective generally, right? Like, he is tall is not affective. Like, I mean, yes, there is a degree of tall. What does tall mean to you? We could argue ourselves back into a corner that there's affective information in all of these. But I think that, again, less interested in what something looks like and more interested in what something feels like. So if something is trying to tell you, a stage direction is trying to say, or you're trying to tell someone in a play what a moment feels like, you're writing an affective stage direction or reading an affective stage direction. If you're describing a visual picture alone, then you're not. And there can be mixes. There can be mixes of visual description and affective description. Like, it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that once we get more comfortable with this concept, we can see how it is actually in almost all stage directions. But I've gone with the most extreme ones to kind of make a big point. And then I think we can work backwards.
I was actually thinking about a kind of really messy archive I'm working on right now. So it is children's theater in the final years of the Ottoman Empire between 1919 and 23, written, directed, composed, and staged by a general. And the group was called the Army of Robust Children. And this is like a vocational project involving 6,000 children. And the robust child is actually like this biopolitical utopia of sorts that is the desire for the future when the empire is failing. So in that context, the child is robust as a stage direction, or anything describing their bodily movements is also intensely affective. So
absolutely.
Maybe also we should think about the context and what kind of bodies are at stake and what's really at stake about the description, because sometimes the description is the performance itself. So
100%, yes. And I have some examples of that. Specifically, I kind of go at the idea that there are, in my 5th chapter, I talk about plays that some people say were written to be read, right? Closet drama. But my argument is always, were they written to be read, or were they written by people who were never going to get a production because they were, for example, an African-American woman in the early 19th century, like the early 20th century here, who was never going to be on Broadway. So again, my point is that when we categorize plays, we often think that straight men are being avant-garde when they have plays outside of the norm, and that everyone else is just not writing for the real theater. Like that tends to be the thing, is like, oh, they look at these great stage directions for our minds. And my question is always, but production teams often read the play before they do the play. So if you're writing for readers, you could still be writing for production. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And you're right, the cultural context in which something is written is absolutely affective. It's part of what we're talking about. And the way that a play is oriented, that's part of what it's responding to, right? In general. That sounds awesome. I would like to be part of a band called the Army of the Robust Children. We can, I will play bass. You can do whatever you want. Thank you so much for this, folks. I'm going to pop my email in the chat here, because I'm not trying to end this, but I just want to make sure that if folks want to email me with more questions, I would be very happy to be in contact with any of you.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So,
thank you.
Before we leave,
there's a comment, Ilhan, on the
okay,
chat box.
okay.
There's a comment, yes. Professor David Dean.
David Dean says, very thought-provoking talk and discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you so much. no more comments or questions. Okay. So before we leave, I would also like to remind you that our webinars will continue on the 8th of December with a distinguished scholar, Milija Gluhovic, presentation on new Silk Roads and performance. You may use the same links you received after your registration to participate our continuing sessions. And thank you all once again for being here with us today. And hope to see you all soon sometime. And have a nice day for you, Dr. Rowan, and have a
Thank you
nice
so
day
much.
for the rest of us.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much, Bess. And thank you everyone for joining us.